Working as a ranger in the wilderness of Blackwood isn't just a job, it's a responsibility, a way of life. Every corner of this forest feels alive, as though it's breathing. I've seen my fair share of accidents, climbers slipping on the rocks, hikers straying off trail and getting lost, a few close calls with wild animals. But lately something different has been happening. People aren't just getting lost or injured, they're disappearing, vanishing without a trace. It all started with Thomas Hale, a solo hiker. He was a regular, signing in at the trailhead like all the others. He was supposed to take the North Ridge Trail but never returned. His car sat in the parking lot for days before anyone noticed. The search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks, but they found nothing. No gear, no clothes, no footprints, nothing at all. That should have been the end of it, just another tragic story of someone swallowed up by the wilderness. But something about it didn't sit right with me. It wasn't until a few weeks later, while I was on patrol near Hemlock Ridge, that things started to take a darker turn. I'd just finished checking the western perimeter when the smell hit me. It wasn't the usual scent of pine and damp earth that you'd expect from a forest. This was rancid, almost nauseating, a mix of wet dog and rotting meat. I froze and scanned the tree line, every muscle in my body tense. Everything looked normal. There were no signs of movement, no animals in sight. But something wasn't right. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and vibrating, like the sound was coming from the very earth beneath me. I froze again, instinct screaming at me to run. Every warning signal in my brain told me to turn back, but curiosity won out. I took a few cautious steps toward the sound, my hand instinctively resting on the sidearm at my belt. My heart raced. I couldn't explain it, but something told me this wasn't just a random encounter with a wild animal. This was something different. That's when I saw it. A massive figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was bipedal, hunched, with the unmistakable shape of something wolf-like, too big to be a bear. Its fur was thick, matted, and dark. But it was its eyes that I'll never forget. They were glowing, a bright, sickly yellow that seemed to pierce through the darkness and lock onto mine. I felt an ice-cold chill crawl down my spine. It snarled, showing teeth that looked more like daggers than anything I'd ever seen on an animal. They gleamed in the dim light, each tooth sharp enough to slice through bone. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I had no business being anywhere near it. The beast took a step forward, its claws digging into the earth with a deep, unsettling sound. My instincts finally kicked in. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in my truck. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning we got another call, this one from a family camping near Eagle Peak. Their teenage son, David, had wandered off during the night and hadn't returned. This wasn't just another case of a hiker getting lost. David's parents swore that he had been in his tent when they went to sleep. But when they woke up, he was gone without a trace. They hadn't heard him leave. They hadn't heard anything at all. I wasn't the only one disturbed by this. The feds arrived 2 days later, men in dark suits who made it clear they didn't want us involved. They took over the investigation, telling us to stay out of it and not speak a word to the media. One of them, a man with a cold stare, barked orders at us. "We'll handle this. No one talks about the missing boy." Got it. They didn't even bother to search. They set up a perimeter around the campsite, told everyone to leave, and started their own investigation. But there was something about their demeanor that set off alarm bells in my head. They were hiding something. I pushed back. "What's going on here? What are you really looking for?" "You're not cleared for this," the agent replied, his voice cold as ice. "Just stay out of our way." I didn't like it. Something was wrong, but I couldn't do much about it at the time. That night, though, I received a call from one of the campers who had been staying near David's site. His voice was shaky, almost trembling. "There's something out there," he said. "Bigger than a bear. Watching us." I pressed him for more details. His description made my blood run cold. He said it was a creature with the body of a man, but covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was wolf-like, elongated, and its eyes, those eyes. He swore it had been standing just beyond the firelight, watching them. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" I asked. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he replied, his voice breaking. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to return to the area where David had disappeared. I knew it was against protocol, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the feds weren't interested in finding the truth. They were more concerned with covering it up. So I grabbed my rifle and headed out alone. That's when I found the tracks. They were huge, twice the size of my boot, with claws that had dug deep into the soil. They weren't animal tracks, not completely. The shape was too narrow, too humanoid. I followed them deeper into the woods, toward a place marked on the map as Dead Man's Hollow. I'd heard stories about Dead Man's Hollow. Locals talked about it in whispers. They said the trees there were cursed, that the place was haunted by something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. I believed in facts. And the facts told me that something was out there, something that had been taking people. The hollow lived up to its name. The trees were twisted, gnarled, their branches curling in every direction, forming an almost impenetrable canopy. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the same rancid smell that had followed me earlier. I choked back a gag and pushed forward, determined to find answers. That's when I found the bones. A pile of them, scattered at the base of a tree, picked clean. They weren't all animal bones. Some were too small, too delicate to belong to anything but a human. My stomach twisted into a knot, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. I spun around, rifle raised, but the creature was too fast. It was right behind me. I caught a glimpse of it, those yellow eyes, that glint of teeth, and then it was gone. It was playing with me, toying with me. I fired blindly into the trees, the sound of the shot ringing in my ears. But the creature was already retreating. I barely made it to my truck. My shoulder was bleeding, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I drove like a man possessed, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I finally reached safety, I reported the attack. The men in suits showed up again. This time they weren't subtle. "You need to forget what you saw," one of them told me, his voice low and threatening. "For your own good," I demanded answers. But they only offered me threats and silence. They confiscated my report, told me to keep my mouth shut, and transferred me to another park. But I can't stay quiet. I know what I saw. I know what's out there. It's real. The government doesn't want you to know because they can't control it. They can't kill it. All they can do is cover up the disappearances and hope that people forget. But I haven't forgotten, and I won't. If you ever find yourself in Blackwood, stay on the marked trails. Don't hike alone. And if you see yellow eyes watching you from the trees, run. Because it's not a bear, and it's not just a wolf. It's something much worse. I had just wrapped up my sophomore year at the University of Wisconsin, majoring in wildlife conservation. The year had flown by faster than I expected, but what really weighed on my mind wasn't my classes or exams. It was the looming anniversary, the 10th anniversary of my sister Lily's disappearance. 10 years since that day in the woods, when she ran ahead of me and never came back. Dad didn't handle it well. He became a shell of the man he used to be. The grief was so intense that it tore apart his marriage with Mom. He blamed himself for letting us out of his sight, for not protecting Lily. His obsession took over his life, an all-consuming need to find whatever killed her. He devoured books on cryptids, paranormal phenomena, anything that could explain what happened. He mapped out sightings of strange creatures, connecting dots on blurry photos, analyzing vague witness testimonies. The Wolfman, they called it. A cryptid said to haunt the woods near the edge of the forest where Lily had vanished. Now, as the 10th anniversary of Lily's death approached, Dad's obsession had grown stronger, darker. His mornings were spent locked in his study, poring over maps, scribbling notes, his mind consumed by the idea that the Wolfman would return. He was convinced that every 10 years, the creature reappeared, and this was our window of opportunity to finally confront it. I wasn't as convinced. The Wolfman seemed like a convenient excuse for Dad to cope with his guilt and grief. The truth was, he was chasing a ghost, a way to channel his rage and pain into something tangible. He was grasping for answers, for revenge, for something to make it all make sense. But part of me, just a tiny part, hoped that maybe he was right. Maybe in those woods, there was something that could bring us closure, something that could help me understand what happened that day. I finished loading our gear into the truck and set the rifle aside, stretching my stiff muscles. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin's porch. I wiped my hands on an old rag, trying to rid myself of the smell of gun oil. Dad appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "You ready?" Jake, he asked, his voice hoarse, a gravelly edge to it. "Yeah, I'm ready," I said, trying to sound confident, though I wasn't sure I felt it. We loaded up the truck. The weight of our gear and weapons, a heavy reminder of what we were really here for. The drive from Madison to the cabin in the northern woods was long and silent, the hum of the engine the only sound between us. I kept my gaze fixed on the landscape outside, trying to push the weight in my chest aside. In the back of my mind, memories of that day played in fragments, Lily laughing as she tugged at my sleeve, urging me to follow her deeper into the woods. I could still feel the sunlight filtering through the trees, hear the rustling of the leaves as we walked. But then the memory would shift. The sunlight would fade, the forest darken, and the sound of Lily's laughter would twist into a scream that shattered the air. And then the shadow, something so huge, so unnatural, that it sent a cold shiver down my spine even now. But the rest was lost, hidden behind a wall of fear and confusion. I snapped out of it when the truck hit a rough patch of road, the sudden jolt making my heart race. Dad glanced at me. "Bad dream?" he asked. I nodded, wiping the sleep from my eyes. The nightmare clung to me like a shadow. "Yeah, just thinking about Lily," I said quietly. We fell into another silence. And this time it stretched between us, thick with unspoken words. Dad occasionally tried to fill the silence with small talk, how my finals had gone, plans for the summer, but his voice lacked energy, as if he were forcing it. I gave short answers, my thoughts elsewhere. As we ventured farther north, the landscape shifted from flat fields to rolling hills and dense forests. It felt like we were entering a different world, one that carried an ancient weight. The air grew cooler, and the trees seemed to stretch higher, their twisted branches reaching for the sky. Finally, we arrived at the cabin. It stood nestled at the edge of a dense forest, an old, weathered structure that seemed to blend with its surroundings. The place hadn't changed much since the last time I was here, though it felt different now. The memories of Lily were everywhere. I could almost hear her laughter echoing through the trees. Dad parked the truck and we stepped out into the cool air, which smelled of pine and damp earth. My chest tightened as we began unloading our gear. I was so used to the cabin feeling like home, but now it felt like a tomb, quiet, oppressive, haunted by the ghosts of the past. We entered the cabin. Inside, it was a mix of old and new, the familiar rustic furniture, but now with piles of maps, old hunting gear, and cryptid books scattered across the table. Dad's obsession was evident in every corner of the room. His eyes were wild, feverish, and when he spoke, it was as if he could barely keep his words contained. "Did you hear about the latest sighting near Eagle River?" Dad asked, laying out a new map on the table, his fingers tracing the path of a supposed wolfman encounter. "I think it's connected. These creatures, they follow certain patterns, certain places. We're getting closer, Jake." I nodded, though my stomach turned. It was always like this, Dad's fixation on the creature, the stories, the evidence. A part of me couldn't deny the eerie possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was something out there, but I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't. Dad talked late into the night, whispering to himself, muttering under his breath, his mind unraveling further with each passing hour. As the moon rose high, casting silver light across the forest, I retreated to my room to escape the intensity of it all. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rustle the trees outside. Then, the dream came again. I was back in the woods. Lily's voice echoed in the distance, carefree, teasing, urging me to chase after her. I ran, my feet pounding the earth, but then the scene shifted. The sky turned dark, the trees twisted and bent as though reaching for me, and there she was, Lily, standing still, her back to me. "Jake," she whispered, her voice faint, like the wind itself. "It's not what you think." I reached out for her, but she turned away, her face filled with fear. She started running, faster than I could keep up. I shouted for her to wait, but the distance between us grew too fast. Then, I saw it, a dark shape in the trees, something massive and inhuman, a shadow too large to belong to anything natural. It moved too quickly, a blur in the corner of my vision, and then the scream. I woke with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if the terror of the dream had followed me into the waking world. I sat up, gasping for breath, the image of Lily's face frozen in my mind. Outside my door, I heard a faint creak, the sound of someone moving. Dad. I opened the door slowly and saw him standing at the end of the hallway, his figure outlined by the moonlight that filtered in through the window. His hand gripped a hunting knife tightly. His eyes were wide, filled with a primal fear. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What's going on?" I heard something he whispered back, a strained urgency in his voice. "Stay quiet. Stay still." I followed him as he moved down the hall, silently. His breath was shallow, but his body was tense, as though he were expecting something to jump out at him from the darkness. We moved to the living room, the old floorboards creaking under our feet. Nothing. The house was silent. Dad turned and looked at me, his face pale and drawn. I heard something. It was moving outside, around the cabin. I didn't know what to think. But whatever he was feeling, I felt it too. The air felt thick with tension, something unseen and heavy. A distant howl broke the silence, low, guttural, almost human. Without a word, Dad motioned for me to follow him outside. We moved carefully, weapons drawn, through the darkened woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. I tried to push the fear down, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. And then, it hit me. The dream. The shadow in the woods. The scream. The terror. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Dad," I whispered. "What if it wasn't the wolfman? What if? What if it was me?" Dad turned to look at me, his face pale, as though something in my words had struck a nerve. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice cracking. I remember I said slowly, my voice shaking. "The dream, the woods. I was the one running after her. I was the one who couldn't catch her. And then I dawned." From an early age, I had always been drawn to the strange and eerie. The world of urban legends fascinated me, especially the one about a creature known as the Canis Man, said to haunt the dense woodlands of the Great Lakes region. I first heard of it late one night on the radio, a voice recounting terrifying stories of a monstrous beast, half human, half dog, that stalked those who dared wander too far into the wild. It wasn't long before my obsession with the creature grew, and I found myself longing to find out for myself if the tale was real. By the time I entered my senior year of high school, I had become consumed with the idea of encountering the Canis Man. Armed with little more than a flashlight and a determined spirit, I ventured into the forest near my home, ready to test the stories I had heard. It was a gloomy evening, the sky overcast with thick clouds, and the air was cool and crisp. Only the faint glow of distant stars illuminated the path before me. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as though the forest was alive, watching me. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, but other than that, everything felt unnervingly still. The silence that surrounded me was almost too complete, as if the world had momentarily ceased to exist. Yet, the longer I walked, the stronger the feeling became something was out there, following me, lurking just beyond my sight. At first, I tried to dismiss the discomfort building in my chest, convincing myself it was just the eerie quiet of the night playing tricks on me. But as I trudged deeper into the heart of the forest, that feeling of being observed grew too intense to ignore. Each rustling of leaves, each snap of a twig beneath my feet, sent a shiver down my spine. But the call of the unknown pushed me onward. I had come too far now. I couldn't turn back. Suddenly, without any warning, the entire forest fell into an unnatural stillness. The rustling of leaves ceased, the distant calls of animals vanished, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In that eerie silence, something deep within me stirred a primal instinct, a sense that I was no longer alone. It was a force that tugged at my very being, urging me to move forward. And then, out of the gloom, I saw them two glowing amber eyes, gleaming like molten gold, staring at me from the darkness. For a long moment, I could only stand there, frozen in place, locked in a terrifying gaze. It was as though time had stopped, and everything in the forest had been drawn into this one moment. Then, as my senses caught up with the fear bubbling in my chest, the creature stepped forward. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. A massive wolf-like figure, standing on two legs, towering over me. Its fur was matted and unkempt, dark as night, blending seamlessly into the surrounding shadows. But it was its eyes, those glowing eyes, that held my gaze. There was something in them, something far beyond the ferocity of an animal, something intelligent and wrong. I had read the legends, heard the stories, but nothing could have prepared me for the presence of the Canis Man. I had imagined it as a myth, an exaggeration of fearful minds, but standing there in the woods, staring into the eyes of the beast, I knew this was real. This was no mere creature of folklore. It was something ancient, something that should not exist. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. Fear had rooted me to the spot, making it impossible to do anything but stare at the monstrosity before me. The creature took a step closer, its massive paws leaving deep imprints in the earth. The air felt thick, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. A low growl escaped from its throat, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath me. That sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I don't know how fast I ran, faster than I ever thought possible. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare stop. The sounds of its pursuit followed me, growing louder with each step, heavy footfalls, closer than I could bear, the low snarl of something predatory and wild. I could hear the beast gaining on me, its breath hot on my heels. The crack of branches and the thud of paws against the earth sounded like thunder, deafening in my ears. That sound snapped me out of my paralysis. I bolted. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus. All that mattered was escape. I slammed the door behind me. panting, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. My mind was racing, trying to process what I had just encountered, but the only thing I could focus on was the image of those glowing eyes burning into me from the darkness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I broke through the tree line. The lights of my house were a beacon in the distance, a safety net that promised warmth and familiarity. Summoning every last ounce of strength, I sprinted across the yard, heart hammering in my chest, and threw open the front door with all the force I could muster. The darkness of the woods seemed to stretch on forever. The forest floor was a blur of roots and undergrowth, threatening to trip me with every step, but I forced myself to push forward. My legs screamed in protest, my chest burned with the strain, but there was no time to stop. The creature was too close. I didn't dare turn around, but I knew it was there. I could feel its presence just beyond the window, watching me. My pulse quickened again as I dared a glance through the glass. There it stood, at the edge of the clearing. The creature's eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity, its form barely visible in the shadows, but its gaze was unmistakable. And then, just as I thought my heart would stop, it smiled. It wasn't a grin of triumph or hunger, it was a cruel, mocking curl of its lips, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. The beast was toying with me, savoring the terror it had instilled in me. I was no longer just a prey, it had made me part of the hunt, its game to play. I staggered away from the window, my mind scrambling to understand what had just happened. I had escaped for now, but the terror of that encounter would haunt me for the rest of my life. I wasn't sure what I had expected when I went out into the woods that night. Maybe a thrilling adventure. Maybe a great story to tell my friends. But I had come face to face with something far worse than I could have ever imagined. And the worst part was, I knew I wasn't the only one. There were others, too, who had met the Canis man. But unlike me, many of them had never come back. From that night forward, I couldn't look at the woods the same way. Even during the day, they seemed darker, more menacing. The trees appeared to whisper secrets to each other, and the breeze carried a sense of something waiting, something watching. To this day, I can't shake the image of those glowing amber eyes, nor the sound of that low, mocking growl. The creature is still out there, somewhere in the darkness of the Michigan woods, watching, waiting.